Hey everyone, welcome to Mobile DevOps is a Thing, a podcast by Bitrise showcasing developers and their processes from all around the world. Today we're focused on all things related to testing, from test automation strategies to manual practices, new technologies, and we'll also share some tips and tricks on how to do things right. My name is Nora Basie and I'm here today with my colleague Peter Meinertzhagen. Hey Peter, thank you so much for joining. How are you today?
Hi, lovely to be here.
Thanks for coming. And our very special guest in this episode is Angie Jones. Hey Angie, how are you today? Thank you so much for joining.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for joining. It's such an honor to talk to you. From what we know, you're the Senior Director of Developer Relations at Apple Tools, and you previously worked at Twitter. You're leading the Test Automation University, and you have more than 25 patented inventions in the US and China. You do so many things. Can you tell us a bit more about your journey of getting here?
Yeah, so started out in tech as an automation engineer. And, I did that for a couple of years as my very first job out of college. And then I did a couple of sprints in feature development as well. But I really liked the automation journey. I felt like I was able to sharpen my skills even more as an automation engineer than as a feature developer, because I had to, architect code frameworks and things like this. When I worked on features, I felt like, the scope of what I was doing was much smaller. And that automation engineer gave me a broader view of the overall product and how our customers use the product. So I went back into automation and have been here ever since.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. I think the best is if we start from the basics. So what are your tips or recommendations for a team that's just getting started with test automation?
I believe that when you're just now starting off, a new team is just starting off, that a lot of times they make a mistake of taking the first step as creating a proof of concept, right? And so I feel like they jump right into the tools and the tech solution. And oftentimes we see projects that start that way fail. And the reason for this is because we haven't taken a moment to understand what's the goal and objective for starting an automation project, and also ensuring that we all agree on what this will look like and the benefits that we'll gain from it, who will take part in it, and essentially just coming up with a strategy. If you do anything else, major that you do, first think of the strategy and then you get into the implementation of it. But for some reason, people don't start there when starting a new automation journey. They jump right into the implementation without understanding the strategy. And then, everyone is surprised when we don't find a good return on the investment. Well, we haven't specified what it is that we were expecting and what was the goal. And, perhaps that goal is to reduce the regression cycles, or perhaps it's to have fast feedback on every check-in. What is the goal? And then you can align your implementation and your strategy to that goal. So I actually have a course on Test Automation University. You mentioned that platform, Nora. It is a free service that provides courses on all things test automation. And there are learning paths there. So, if you want to do mobile or UI or API, and, there's paths for all of the various programming languages. But at the top of every path is a course that I teach that helps you define the strategy of test automation. So it helps frame the way that you think about it and make sure that you and your team members are on the same page before embarking on this journey.
Would you say the same rules apply for really small teams who are just getting started with test automation as it does much larger teams who perhaps need to stick much more rigidly to a strategy?
Yeah, I think it applies even if you were a solo man team, right? Just jumping out there and automating scripts is not it's not a good approach, right? You have to figure out what it is that you're hoping to do, and especially if it's a small team, because you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do. So scoping that down to what's realistic and will that still be advantageous to us is important.
And as a team kind of grows its test suite, starts doing more and more automated testing, what tips would you give them to help them manage that? And I mean, beyond having a very clear strategy at the beginning, is there anything else when it comes to managing a more advanced test suite over time?
Yeah. So when you first start out a project, usually you're automating locally, you're running the tests on your local machine, you're reporting the results back to the team. As a team matures and you have more and more tests, you start looking for alternative ways to execute these tests. So that might be a continuous integration build, where you have your tests kind of blocking or gating deployments. In that sort of scenario, I think of this as, okay, your tests can be kind of patched together. If you're running them locally, you can run them. You can determine like this is just failures or not, and you can report that back to the team. When you're running as part of a CI, your tests have to be a lot better. They have to be trustworthy and strong and not fragile and things like this. So that kind of affects the way that you develop those tests. It has to be with much more care and rigid. And not only that, when you're running and growing your test suite, you have to be mindful of the time it'll take to execute it. Again, what's the goal? Is the goal fast feedback? If so, then having a test suite that takes an hour to run on every check-in is not accomplishing that goal. And that's what I mean when I say, okay, we have to think about what's the goal first, and then we can align the strategy with that goal. Because if I know the goal is fast feedback, maybe we specify an SLA for the time that it'll take to run this suite. We can all contribute tests that meet that SLA, and overall look at the performance of our tests and the execution, and what other strategies should we pull in? Should we maybe run in parallel? And again, if you're going to do that, that determines how you write the test as well. They can't rely on shared data or be dependent upon each other. So there's a lot to consider, and it's better if you consider these things earlier in the process so that you don't have to refactor your entire automation suite when you get into the hundreds and thousands of tests.
So basically, there is no one size fits all.
Oh, of course not. There's never a one size fits all, but there are some common practices that I think any team can take advantage of.
You mentioned reaching a more and more advanced level in testing. And throughout your career, you've probably seen a lot of testing processes as an insider and how things work under the hood. And I was wondering if there are any kind of telltale signs or characteristics that tell you about the maturity level of a team when it comes to testing.
Yes, I actually did some research on this, and I wrote a blog post about a maturity model for test automation. So you can measure this. And some of the factors that I considered were, what tests, do you automate any tests at all, right? So of course, if you're not even at that stage, you're in, infancy or even pre-infancy stage. And then looking at the type of test you automate. So there's some teams who are really good at least automating the unit tests, right? Their developers are focused on this, and that's great, but they haven't gotten to anything beyond this, right? So that's still a very early kinds of maturity level. And then looking at different types of tests. So then do you go on to do API tests? Do you have any for web or mobile? What about the other non-functional type of tests like security and accessibility and performance? So looking at all of these, you can gain more points on this maturity model. Also, in looking at cross-platform, do you execute on just one device or one browser, or are you automating across multiple browsers and devices and viewport sizes that your product supports? So that's additional maturity points. And then looking at other things like CI/CD, do your test gate the CI/CD? Like I said, that's a pretty high maturity level once you get to that stage. And then another one I look at is feature flags as well. So that's like top maturity level for me, where you're able to incorporate feature flags in the product and utilize them within your testing strategy so that you're kind of testing in production, but without affecting the customer.
Moving on to the concept of visual testing, how can visual testing help us to increase the quality of mobile apps?
If we think about traditional test automation tools, all of them interrogate the DOM, or if you're talking about mobile testing, that would be the structure under the surface of the app, right? That's what's being queried. So for example, if I ask, if this button was in the on the app, is it present? Is it enabled? Traditional testing tools are going to look under the covers to determine if that button is present, and will determine, if it's enabled based on the structure of the code, right? So visual testing takes this a step further because that can be unreliable. Like, yes, this button is present, and yes, it is enabled, but did you know that it was the same color as the background? And so your users can't even see it. Or the text on it, might be the same color as the button. And so they don't know what this button is used for. So that's the visual testing aspect, to kind of look at the application at a surface level, the way our customers would, and be able to detect if there are any visual bugs on your application. And actually, it goes a step further to also kind of incorporate our functional testing needs as well. For example, let's say I'm using an app that's an e-commerce app, and I want to verify that a product has been added to the cart properly, right? So when I do my functional assertions here, I might see if the product name is in this cart, and I pass the test based on that. But when you think about this really, and if we were doing this manually, there would be so many other things we would verify, probably subconsciously. So we would make sure not just the name, but we would make sure like the thumbnail of the product is there. We would make sure the price that's listed for this item is correct. We would make sure that if there are any other products in the cart, that the total reflects a sum of all of these, right? We would look at if there was any tax and make sure that was right. There's so many other things that, we would subconsciously verify that never makes it into our functional automated scripts. So with visual testing, because it is taking a picture of your app and verifying everything on it, then it covers a lot of the things that we would have covered subconsciously if we were manually testing, but miss it in our traditional automated tests.
And what about artificial intelligence? Because as far as I know, there are already some AI-based technologies implemented into, for example, unit testing. Do you think it's going to play a bigger and bigger role in the future of test automation?
Absolutely. A lot of test automation efforts or initiatives fail. And I believe that AI can definitely help us with a lot of this. We see this in so many different instances. For example, in visual testing, Amplitude uses AI to basically compare the screenshots of your application during regression runs. So it's much more sophisticated. We also see it in functional testing tools where locators are a big problem in test automation. The locators change, or, they're not stable or whatever. So we see like different approaches to using AI to be able to help with this. I'm seeing other cool applications of AI, for example, like generating test cases based on how your users are using a product. So being able to detect patterns that they're seeing by users, and then identifying tests based on that. I saw another cool application where it used AI to determine which tests should be run as part of a check-in, like which areas of the code were impacted, what developer was it, a lot of different conditions to determine like what would be the best test to run as part of this check-in. So I definitely think AI is going to be even more prevalent in the coming years, and we'll see how it doesn't replace us. It's there to assist us and help us make smart decisions and expedite what it is that we're doing.
Continuing that kind of theme of looking at the future of testing, what's your opinion about the future of codeless testing tools and their effects on the test engineer's role?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, because we started out in test automation with these codeless tools. And back then, they weren't very good, right? So I'm talking like early 2000s is when we saw this a lot. And they weren't very good, and they caused a lot of headache and pain when trying to maintain these automated scripts that were generated from the codeless tools. Now we're starting to see them resurface, and they're much better nowadays, right? And so the web in general has gotten better. The tools have gotten smarter. Some of them are incorporating AI to assist with some of the things that were challenging before. So it looks a lot more promising than it did back in the day, but we still have community members who were, they were burned by these types of tools in the past. And so they don't have a lot of faith in them right now, but we're starting to see other areas in tech also move towards these no code or low code type solutions, even in front end development, for example, right? And so I think there's a shift that is going on in the industry, and I think these will be a lot more acceptable in the short-term future.
So, as we said in the beginning, you work at Applitools now, which is the world's most intelligent test automation platform, and it helps developers in a lot of different types of testing. Could you explain to us how it helps with, for example, accessibility, localization, A/B testing, and so on?
It assists with all of that, all of those things. So in accessibility, you can utilize this. Essentially, you have like this visual testing. So if you think about a robot pair of eyes, essentially, that has the AI smarts, you ask yourself, what can I do with this? And initially, Applitools started as verifying the images of your application for, the visual bugs. And then we started realizing as practitioners, we can also use this for the functional test. So that's what I told you, how it's covering, a lot more. I like to think of a picture is worth 1,000 assertions. So it's covering a lot of the assertions that we didn't explicitly name. And then you think about it even broader and say, what else can I do with this, my AI set of eyes, right? For accessibility testing, one of the key guidelines is to make sure that your elements that are overlaying on top of each other have the proper contrast so that it's readable and visible to everyone. And so, okay, if I have AI and it's, visually looking at the screen, then why couldn't it also make sure that the contrast between elements is good? So Applitools now provides that functionality with a feature called the Contrast Advisor. Also, if we look at things like localization, so this is a very tough area to automate. I know most of the teams that I've worked on in the past, we've had separate localization teams, mostly based out of whatever country that language was originated from. And we have the locals to that language essentially doing manual testing. And this was pretty costly. And this is something that we only did maybe at the end, right before release. Well, now people are wanting to release a lot faster, and they're not waiting weeks and months between releases. So how do you automate something like that without, writing different code bases for each one? Well, since we have visual tests, we can take pictures of the application, in its golden state. So you have the expert from these localized regions verify and make sure that everything is okay. And that becomes a regression test that we can then run over and over again at every check-in if we wanted to, and make sure that those localized applications still look the way that we specified them to. And then if you think about A/B testing, this is something that we didn't even really ever try to automate, because with A/B testing is multiple variations, which means you would have to write like 2 different code blocks for these 2 different types of tests, right? But with the visual testing, we've added the capability to store multiple valid screenshots of you're trying out a couple of different variations for the holidays, and you want to know which one is going to perform the best. So you want to make sure you have some automated tests, because you don't want to skew the results where one variation looks like it's performing better, but that's because the other one has a huge bug or something like that. So you can do this by simply taking pictures of all of the variations and telling amplitudes, here, if it matches either of these variations, then it's okay.
And could you tell us a little bit more about Applitools' Ultrafast Test Cloud?
So this is one of my favorite features from Applitools. What this does is enable me to do that cross-platform testing. And this is one of those maturity metrics that I mentioned earlier. We have a bad habit when we're writing our tests to only focus on, maybe one browser, possibly 2. But this is a mobile first world, right? Even if it's not an app, a mobile app per se, people are accessing your application from their devices on the go and different viewports. I have an Android, someone else might have an iPhone, someone might be viewing in landscape mode. Like, there's just all sorts of devices and configurations out here. So the Ultrafast grid will allow you to visually test your application across any of the configurations that you specify, without having to own any of these devices. So there's no lab where I have to have, all of these different mobile devices and, versions of them. Instead, I can use the Ultrafast cloud, indicate, here, I would like to run across all of these different browsers, viewport sizes, and mobile devices. And I don't have to change my test to do so. I essentially just give a list of these configurations. And what Applitools is going to do is run my test one time across one configuration, maybe Chrome. And then when it's in the state that I'm ready to do my assertion, it grabs the application in its current state, all of the resources for that application. So the HTML or the JavaScript, the CSS, whatever artifacts are needed, images, etc. And it blasts that across all of the configurations that I specified in parallel to make sure that each of them look the way that I wanted them to look. So it's really nice. It's lightning fast, and it gives great coverage for your application.
So now that we've talked quite a lot about automating more and more in the testing process, I just remember that in one of your talks, you argued that not every type of test should be automated. And I was just wondering which type of test you think should still be performed manually and why.
Yeah, so I have a matrix that I follow to determine this. There's no like, oh, this type of test should always be manual. We used to say that sort of thing about, usability tests or accessibility tests, but the tools have gotten so much better and so much smarter that that's simply not true anymore. So any type of test can be automated. However, every test itself, every scenario doesn't necessarily need to be automated. So what I do is I use this matrix that scores a test on 4 different areas. So it looks at what is the risk involved in this scenario. So if this were to fail, what does that mean for us, right? It looks at the cost efficiency of automating this test. So is it hard? Is it easy? Is it going to take us forever? Is it worth it based on the value that it provides? It also looks at the historical data of the test. So, for example, is this a problematic area of the application? And if so, then perhaps we need to add some more tests here. And then also, like, how much new information is this going to provide to us, right? Is this something that we already have, 10 tests for? Do we need yet another test that's just simply another variation of that test? Maybe not, right? And so given these criteria, with the model, I give you a scoring mechanism. So you can add points to each of your tests that you're considering automating. And then you can look at what that score is, right? And so it varies from 0 to 100. And I often say, well, anything that's maybe 66 or above definitely needs to be automated. Anything that is 33 and below definitely does not need to be automated. And then anything that's in the middle is kind of up for fair game. The great thing about this is you have these scored, so you can put them in the order of priority. Things that are the highest score or your highest priority things you should automate. And if you get through your top 33% of what you should automate, then you can start looking at that middle half of that.
And teams that are mixing together automated and manual testing, are there any things that teams need to be aware of in making sure that those tests work together well and their suite is functional?
There definitely needs to be collaboration. I don't recommend having your testers or your team in general work in different silos, right? So on my teams, I follow the practice of all of us kind of have a testing strategy meeting almost at the beginning of every sprint. And so we might go through the exercise of which tests are we going to automate. Once we identify even which ones we're going to automate, we'll have a discussion about at which level are we going to automate. Which of these would be great for unit tests? Which ones would be great for API level tests? Which ones would be great for UI tests, right? And that's really good. But I also include the manual testers in this as well, because not everything needs to be automated, but that doesn't mean that not everything needs to be tested, right? So determining, okay, which ones are we going to test? And sometimes we test it and we automate it, right? We manually test it and we automate the test for it. The reason for this is, like I said, there's a lot of kind of subconscious type of assertions and analysis that's going on when someone is manually testing something that doesn't always get captured within the script itself. Also, I really like and encourage exploratory testing and, thinking of all of these creative and various scenarios, but that doesn't mean that's something that needs to be run on every single check-in, for example, right? So yeah, working together, collaborating at the beginning of a sprint to determine how are we going to tackle the testing of this.
When it comes to mobile test automation frameworks, how do you choose between them?
So it depends on the application, of course, right? So I think of a case where I was working at Twitter, and they wanted me to create a new automation framework for automating the iOS tests. So the questions I started asking were, okay, so I'm going to automate these on iOS. Will we ever have a need to automate these same scenarios on Android, for example, right? And if so, that affects my decision. Do I really want to rewrite all of these tests, or could there be some reuse? So maybe you want to use a tool that will support the authoring once and running across more than one type of mobile OS. So that's a big consideration. Also, who's going to contribute to the test? So usually you don't have the same developers writing your Android features in your iOS features. Sometimes these are two different specialties. They're two different programming languages. If you want the developers to contribute to this initiative, then having the iOS developer write mobile tests in Java might not be the smartest way to get that to happen, right? And so ultimately, I did end up using, native Apple XCUI tests, for example, for those iOS tests. And I was quite surprised at the level of engagement and contributions from the development team because, I was writing in tools and languages that they were already familiar with.
I would assume, or I guess it's safe to say that the day-to-day work of test engineers change as testing tools advance over time. So based on the trends you've seen in the past few years, what would you expect from the upcoming years, like in the future of testing and in the daily work of test engineers? How do you think it will change?
A friend of mine, Jason Arburn, he's a really brilliant guy. He's a founder of a company called Test.ai. He's been doing some thinking, and he wrote this really interesting post about the future tester. And I actually turned that into a cute little video. I should publish that on my YouTube pretty soon. It essentially looked at a day in the life of a software tester in, say, like the year 2050. And it was very different than the landscape that we see now, right? It wasn't someone kind of at their desk cranking out scripts. It was more of someone controlling the bots and the AI and essentially providing it with strategy and direction on what it is that they need done, and then having those bots do those things for them. So I thought this was really interesting and a really believable future of testing, because that's where we're really strong of thinking of strategy, of thinking of how our customers are going to utilize the project. And so using our brains more versus, hacking away at code, that sort of thing that's a thing that can be automated as well, And so I found that really, really interesting and pretty believable.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. So just to make sure I get it correctly, the article is the future tester, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put it in the show notes.
I wanted to ask you about the Test Automation University. You mentioned it a little bit earlier in terms of kind of some great courses for people getting started with automated testing. I mean, it's got over 100,000 members now. How has the process been for you in building that university up from scratch?
It's been quite the journey. It's been very rewarding. So when I first started this, I was teaching workshops, automation workshops across the globe. I would go to conferences or go to companies and teach these things. And I would promote that I'm going to be in London. I'm going to teach, a Selenium workshop or something like this. And it never fails. I would have people from other parts of the world to say, hey, I don't live in London, but I'm really interested in that workshop. And can it be made available online? So it was always something that I wanted to do, is to kind of make my content more accessible to the global testing community. But I only thought about my content, right? And as I started brainstorming this with other folks at Applitools, they had the vision to do something even bigger. So not just my tools, not just, my Selenium workshops, but something that is beneficial to everyone, that encompasses courses from other instructors. And I was quite intimidated by such a big ask. And so I sat on it for a couple of days and thought it through to think about, is this something that I can even pull off? And after a couple of days, I decided to take on the challenge. And I sat down, and with all of my experience in automation and working on different teams in different areas, different types of automation, I put together this mega kind of wish list of curriculum, right? So if I'm looking at mobile testing, what do I need to know? If I'm looking at web testing, what do I need to know? If I'm looking at API testing, what skills do I need, right? And I drew all of this out, and all of the courses, and in the order that they should be taken, and all of this. And then I went out into the community and reached out to the experts in those areas, in those tools, in those programming languages, and asked them to create courses for this initiative. And just about everyone said yes, which was amazing. So this is truly a community-driven effort where all of these wonderful people have taken quite a bit of time out to create these courses and make them all available for free to the testing and even the development community. So it's been quite rewarding just looking at the journey. I look at people who may have been a manual tester and had a desire to switch to test automation. And, these courses have been the avenue that they've taken to get there. And they've been successful in it. I get messages every week of people saying, thank you for the courses. I was able to, get my dream job, or I was able to get a promotion at work because of this. Or I even have people who from different areas who want to break into tech and use Test Automation University to do so. There's people who are in tech, but maybe in other areas. There's a woman, she was in the top 100 users of TAU. And her story, she was actually in HR, and she wanted to get into a more technical role and utilize these courses to do just that. So it's been quite the journey watching this community grow into over 100,000 users, watching lives be changed with this initiative. And it's one of the proudest moments I've had in my career.
And where do you go from now? I mean, over 100,000 members. Do you have a dream goal in mind for where you take the university?
I don't have like big ambitious plans past this. My goal was not even the number of community members. My goal was to create the lanes that people can go into. So right now, what I do is make sure that, I'm on top of what's new, what's happening in test automation. For example, there's a new web framework that came out maybe last year or a year before, but it was definitely after Test Automation University was launched. So, I have to learn that or find someone who does know it and have them teach the courses. So making sure like these courses are staying up to date with the current trends. And some unintentional benefits that have come from this is people are now using this, like companies are using it to onboard new members, or they're using it to upskill their departments. And so there's a lot of responsibility now to make sure that all of the information that we're providing is correct and accurate and valid and relevant to real software development. So that's where my focus is, just keeping it going, making sure that we are continuing to provide what's needed, and even working with companies more so now to see what needs they have that we're not addressing.
Test Automation University is where you share a lot of your knowledge and expertise through these courses. And I suppose that all the positive feedback keeps you motivated. My question would be about where do you get your knowledge from, and where do you get the inspiration from to do this?
the community keeps me inspired. Comments and messages from people really make my day, really help me realize that what I'm doing is of value and worthwhile to the community. So that's great. As far as how do I, obtain the knowledge, I am first and foremost a community member myself. So I'm not someone who's, just trying to guess on what people need. I actually know because, I'm an automation engineer myself. I keep up to date with what's going on. What are people writing about? What are they talking about? What struggles are people having at different companies? So I often talk to practitioners as well as leaders within the testing space to see what are they up to? What are they doing? How are they solving their challenges? Are there any obstacles in the way? And then I look for trends across the industry. Like, is this something that everyone is struggling with? And then, try to think of how can I assist them with this sort of thing.
We've touched on a few of these things already throughout this conversation, but if someone came to you and said that they wanted to start a career in mobile test automation, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I would first have them study about mobile testing in general. So mobile testing, as you all know, is a different beast with different challenges. So if you came from web testing, you do have a leg up in understanding like automation in general, but there's some specific use cases that deal with mobile testing. So understanding those, how to test a mobile app in general before you get to the automation part. And then understanding like, okay, not just the scenarios, but the challenges like, offline, network connectivity, how much data people have, their bandwidth, their network speed, all sorts of things that you need to consider as a mobile tester, right? And then kind of looking at the various tools that are available and figuring out which ones meet the needs that you have. And just kind of learning the tools, playing with them. There's a lot that gets in the way when we talk about mobile testing, mobile apps. Like I remember testing them and all sorts of things I would have to worry about that I didn't have to worry about in web testing, animations and pop-ups and things like this, because people are using different marketing strategies and different ways to engage with their users while they're on the go. So those are things you need to be aware of as a mobile automation engineer.
Let's talk a bit about DevRel as well, because it's quite an important part of your life, and it's quite a new type of career path, and it's becoming more and more trendy, I would say. So what does DevRel mean to you, and what would you suggest to people who want to build a career in this field?
Yeah, so let me talk about what DevRel is and how I got into it. So I was working as, just an automation engineer. This was even before Twitter, where I was writing content and, speaking at conferences and doing, webinars and podcasts like this one. And it got to the point I was doing it so often, I may have been on the road, like say 80% of the time. And I would still need to do my regular engineering job as well. So that became quite challenging. And I thought to myself, I need to figure out a way how to do this content creation stuff full time. And I didn't know at the time that this was actually a job called developer relations. And so with developer relations, that's exactly what I do, is create content for the community to help them be better software engineers. And so I'm doing this now at Aptitudes, where, of course, I am a big fan of visual testing, but also other approaches as well. And so I teach and train and produce content on all things in test automation, not just visual testing. And I like to think of developer relation role as, me working for the community and having some companies sponsor this initiative. So that's what DevRel is all about, is, community members helping community members, and doing that via different means. So videos, blog posts, code samples, all that jazz.
And as one final question, the least technical question that we've asked during this podcast, but how do you describe your job to your family?
So I describe my job, probably I describe it as a developer relations person. I describe it as, I teach the world's engineers, essentially. So, I brag to my family like, my skills are too good to sit in one company or one four walls. And so I travel all over and speak with engineers globally to help them solve their challenges.
Oh, that's a good one. Unfortunately, that's all the time we had for today. Again, thank you so much, Angie, for coming to our podcast. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and we have learned so much today.
Thank you so much, Nora and Peter. This was great. Thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, Peter, for joining as well. Everyone, thank you for listening. You'll find all the resources in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode and stay tuned for the next one. Bye.